So welcome back, dear students. Today we will learn about the justiciability of directive principles of state policy. This will be a second lecture from Unit 4. So far as justiciability or enforceability of directive principles of state policy is concerned, we have learned in the earlier lecture also that these principles were not made enforceable by the Constituent Assembly, which was formed to draft the Indian Constitution. But the non-enforceability of the principles does not mean that they are of no importance. There are some authors which are in favor of its enforceability, and some are against the making of these principles as enforceable. Those who favor the enforcement of principles, they argue that enforceability of directive principles will keep a check on the government and would unite India. For instance, Article 44 of Indian Constitution talks about the Uniform Civil Code, which aims for uniform provisions of civil law for all the citizens of the country, irrespective of their caste, creed, religion, or beliefs. Authors who are against the enforcement of directive principles are of the view that these principles need not be separately enforced, as there are already many laws which indirectly implement the provisions mentioned in directive principles of state policy. For instance, Article 40 of the Constitution, which deals with Panchayati Raj system, was introduced through a constitutional amendment, and it is very evident that there are numerous panchayats existing in the country today. And as recently you have seen that the panchayat elections were held in UP, and its last phase ended only yesterday. Then another argument against directive principles of state policy is that it imposes morals and values on the citizens of the country. It should not be clubbed with law, as it is really important to grasp that law and morals, which are different concepts. If we impose one on the opposite other, that will generally impede the expansion and development of the society. Now let us see, dear students, what is the importance of directive principles of state policy. Directive principles, they cover from Article 36 to 51 in Part 4th of the Constitution. It mentions the protection of women of the country, environmental conservation, rural growth and development, decentralization of power, uniform civil code, etc., which are considered some of the essentials in making laws for a welfare state. Although they are non-justiciable, still they provide a set of guidelines for the government for its functioning in the country. Now let us see the significance of directive principles of state policy. Number one, these directive principles are non-justiciable, but they are backed by voice of the people, known as vox populi, which is a real sanction behind every law in our country in its true sense. Point number two, regarding significance, that directive principles of state policy gives the philosophical foundation of a welfare system. These principles make it responsibility of the state to secure it through welfare legislations. Third, their nature is more of a moral ideals. They constitute a moral code for the state, but this does not reduce their value, as moral principles are very important and the absence of it may hamper the growth of a society. A state is run by its people, and the government is always formed and managed by them. So it's really important to have a set of standards for making laws in the country. Point number four regarding significance is that directive principles act as a guide for the government which helps them in making policies and laws for the purpose of securing justice and welfare in the state. Point number 5, these principles are like a source of continuity in the governance of the country, because in a democratic system, the governments change after regular elections, and every new government makes different policies and laws for the country. The presence of such guidelines is really important because it ensures that every government will follow this set of principles in the form of directive principles while formulating its laws. You all of you are aware that central government also changes with passage of time in different elections, and likewise state governments are also changing time and again during elections. So party may change, government may change, but the directive principles for making law should remain the same. That is the significance of directive principles. Sixth significance is that directive principles can be called as positive directions for the state, which helps in securing social and economical dimensions of democracy. These principles are actually supplementary to the fundamental rights, which offer political rights and other freedoms. They both are nothing without each other, as one provides social and economic democracy, while the other provides political rights. Seventh significance is that directive principles of state policy make it possible for the people to measure the worth of a government and its working. A government which does not consider these principles can be rejected on this ground by the people in favor of a government which gives due importance to the task of securing these directive principles in the state. And the eighth significance is that directive principles constitute a manifesto of a nation as to what a nation is going to do. These reflect the ideas and views which were there in the mind of the drafters of the Constitution while drafting the Constitution. These reflected the philosophy behind making of the Constitution, and hence they provide useful information to the courts in interpreting the existing provisions in the Constitution and in coming up with better laws and policies. Ninth significance is that directive principles do not seem to be very rigid in their meanings, and this helps the state in interpreting and applying these principles in accordance with the situation prevailing at a given time. So, dear students, we can conclude in a sense that inclusion of part 4th of our Constitution, which contains these directive principles of state policy, proved to be very useful for our country. The principles provide good foundations for welfare state. The securing of directive principles helped in completing the requirements of a democratic system. It supplemented the fundamental rights of the people and built a state characterized by these 4 pillars, that is justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity. Now, dear students, let's understand how far directive principles of state policy have been implemented or not, because they are not justiciable, they are not enforceable through court of law. So far as implementation of directive principles is concerned, there is no need of any constitutional amendment, and simple legislation by the parliament is adequate to implement the directive principles. The state has made few efforts till date to implement the directive principles, and there are certain acts and policies from 1950 onwards which had been implemented to give effect to these directive principles. The examples are like Minimum Wages Act 1948 has been enacted to ensure the directive principle of state policy that minimum wages are to be given to the laborers. Then Child Labor Prohibition and Regulation Act 1986 has been enacted, which prohibits the child labor, and it implements another directive principle of state policy that child shall not be employed in hazardous factories. Then comes Maternity Benefit Act 1961. In government services, the ladies are given maternity leave and other maternity benefits during pregnancy. This act also implements one of the directive principles of the state policy. Then Equal Remuneration Act 1976 says that male and female both shall be given equal remuneration. So this is for advancement of ladies also. Then we have few programs like Integrated Rural Development Program, IRDP, 1978. Then in 1989, we had Jawahar Rozgar Yojana. Then Swarn Jayanti Gram Swarajgar Yojana in 1999. Then Sampurn Gram Rozgar Yojana 2001. Then Manrega, Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Program 2006. Then National Forest Policy was also formed in 1988 to implement the directive principles for conservation of forests. Then, dear students, there is a very glaring illustration that Article 21 capital A was inserted in our constitution by 86th constitutional amendment, making free education for children below the age of 14 years as compulsory. See, this directive principle of giving free education to the children below the age of 14, this directive principle has now been converted into a fundamental right. I have highlighted this portion in red ink, that directive principle of state policy of providing free education to every children below the age of 14 years has now been enacted as fundamental right under Article 21 capital A. Then there we have another directive principle for upliftment of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes and other weaker sections of the societies. So we have enacted the Scheduled Caste and Scheduled Tribe Prevention of Atrocities Act 1989 for safeguarding the interest of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. And then we have several land reforms acts all over the India. Like in UP, we have Uttar Pradesh Zamindari Abolition and Land Reforms Act of 1950. And the central idea of this act is that land must remain with the tiller of the soil, meaning thereby whosoever is working in the fields should get the benefit of that land. Land should belong to the person who is actually tilling the soil. So dear students, let's see now the distinction between fundamental rights and directive principles of state policy. First of all, with reference to meaning, fundamental rights are essential or basic rights granted to all the citizens of the country, whereas directive principles are the guidelines which are considered while formulating policies and laws. Now, from definition point of view, fundamental rights are defined in part 3rd of the Constitution, whereas directive principles of state policy are defined in part 4th of Constitution. Regarding nature, fundamental rights are negative in nature, whereas directive principles are positive in nature. From the point of view of enforceability, fundamental rights are legally enforceable, whereas directive principles are not enforceable. From democracy point of view, fundamental rights ensure political democracy, whereas directive principles ensure the social and economic democracy. From legislation point of view, for implementation of fundamental rights, the legislations are not required. But in new circumstances, of course, new legislations may be required. But for implementation of directive principles, legislations are required. Now, from the angle what is to be promoted, through fundamental rights, we promote individual welfare. And through directive principles, we promote public welfare. Now, between the fundamental rights and directive principles, who is supreme? We will learn regarding supremacy of fundamental rights and directive principles of state policy with the help of case study. The question of great importance is whether fundamental rights precedes directive principles or later takes a higher position than the former. It has been a subject of argument for years together after commencement of Constitution. And there are some important judicial pronouncements which tried to give an answer to this question as to who will prevail between fundamental rights and directive principles. And first leading case after commencement of constitution is the Kerala Education Bill. In this case, the Supreme Court said that if a conflict arises between fundamental right and directive principles, the harmony between the two should not be disturbed. But if after applying the doctrines of interpretation, the conflict does not resolve, then what will happen? Then fundamental rights should be upheld and given more importance over the directive principles. That is, I have written in the bracket 3/4. 3/4 is a code that directive principles in part 3rd were given preference and part 4th of directive principle was suppressed. So this is a code word between you and me, 3/4. Then came the important case, State of Madras versus Champakhanderajan, although it was earlier in point of time in 1951. In this case also, it was held that if any law is in contravention of the provisions mentioned under part 3rd of Indian Constitution, it would be void. But this is not applicable in case of directive principles. This shows that fundamental rights are on the higher pedestal than directive principles as far as this case is concerned. Again, the result is 3/4. And it was held in this case that the reservation GO was in violation of Article 29, Clause 2 of the Constitution of India. And this judgment led to the first constitutional amendment, where the right was given that reservation can be done in favor of weaker sections of the society. So in this case also, the position remained 3/4, that fundamental rights were given preference and directive principles were suppressed. Then came Golaknath's case. Again, the equation is 3/4. Fundamental rights were given preference. How? Court held that the parliament cannot curtail the fundamental rights in making any law or policy for the country. It also mentioned that if a law has been made to give effect to Article 39B and C of Part 4th of the Constitution, and in doing so, if Article 14, 19 or 31 gets violated, then it cannot be declared as void merely on the ground of such contravention. Meaning thereby that fundamental rights were given preference over the directive principles in Golaknath's case also. Then came Keshavanand Bharati's case. The equation was reversed. The apex court placed directive principles of state policy on a higher position than fundamental rights. And it was held that Parliament can amend any part of the Constitution of India, even if that is in violation of fundamental rights. The only rider was that basic features or basic essentials of the Constitution cannot be amended. So here the equation was reversed 4/3, means part 4th, directive principles were given preference and part 3rd was reduced to a lower position. Then came Minerva Mills case. Here the equation is 3=4. It was held in this case that harmony between fundamental rights and directive principles should be maintained because neither of the two has any precedence over each other. Both are complementary to each other and they should both are complementary to each other and they should be balanced anyhow for the proper functioning of the state. So equation started from 3/4, Keshavanand Bharati 4/3, Minerva Mill 3=4. That directive principles and fundamental rights are equally important and a balance and harmony has to be maintained between the two parts of the Constitution. Then came Uni Krishna versus State of AP. In this case, Supreme Court was again of the view that fundamental rights and directive principles are not exclusive, but they are complementary to each other. The court said that fundamental rights are the ways through which the goals given in part 4th can be achieved. So in this case also, fundamental rights and directive principles were equated. So dear students, to conclude, if I may say so, that the significance of directive principles of state policies cannot be cannot be looked down upon just because it is not enforceable in any court of law. These principles were added in the Constitution to facilitate the governance and smooth functioning of the country. It was added to meet the main objectives and the ultimate goal of the country, that is to work for the welfare of its citizens. There are some important acts enacted by the parliament, so we can't say that directive principles are not implemented and they have no importance at all. You cannot say it. You see, it is like a structure given for the government, and it should work and formulate new laws revolving around the structure only, so that welfare of the people be ensured. So every policy and every law formulated by the state has to meet these standards which are mentioned in Part 4 of the Constitution. Dear students, even if directive principles of state policy are non-justiciable, they are implemented through important acts passed by the parliament, and they hold equal relevance and importance as fundamental rights mentioned in Part 3 of Constitution of India. So dear students, this is all about regarding justiciability of fundamental rights. Thank you very much. God bless you.